Good afternoon, and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Meet the Scientist monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Peter Tarr. I'm BBRF's editorial director and chief science writer, and I'm filling in for Dr. Jeffrey Bornstein, BBRF's president and CEO, who had an urgent commitment and sends his sincere regrets that he can't be with us today. He'll be here next time. In today's webinar, Dr. Nadya Modyanova will present how hand gestures can support communication for those with autism and ADHD and/or language impairments. BBRF is the world's largest private funder of mental health research grants, supporting transformative discoveries in order to develop improved treatments, cures, and methods of prevention. The high quality of the research that we fund is made possible by the BBRF Scientific Council. This group of 191 prominent mental health researchers reviews each grant application and selects the most promising ideas with the greatest potential to lead to breakthroughs. The Scientific Council guides the foundation to fund creative and impactful basic, translational, and clinical research relevant to the whole spectrum of mental health. One reason that the research funded by BBRF has such great impact, and it does, is because we don't limit our focus to one illness or condition. Since 1987, when we were founded, BBRF has awarded it's actually now $487 million to fund more than 6,800 research grants around the world and across a broad spectrum of brain illnesses, including addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, PTSD, schizophrenia, as well as suicide prevention. Now, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Nadya Modyanova. Dr. Modyanova is an assistant research professor in the Department of Mechanical and Industrial Engineering, Montana State University, and an adjunct instructor at Interlink International Institutes. She is a 2025 recipient of BBRF's Young Investigator Grant. Our webinar will begin with Dr. Modyanova's presentation, which then may be followed by a Q&A if time permits. To submit your questions, please, while the webinar is in progress, use the Questions tab on the control panel on your screen, and please feel free to submit your questions at any time. Following the presentation, I will ask as many questions as possible in the time that we still have. And now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Modyanova.
Thank you very much, Peter. All right, thank you all very much for coming today to my talk. I will talk about how hand gestures can support communication for those with autism, ADHD, and language impairments. And here is the outline for today. I'd like to start with a brief warm-up, then I'll go through acknowledgements, then tell you about language, neurodiversity, and gestures, and go over some research highlights. So what I'd like you to do is to think about what brings you here today and type a keyword into Q&A. Are you curious about gestures? Is it a personal experience? What else? And Peter will maybe read out a few of the keywords that you write. So please take 30 seconds to share in the Q&A what brings you here today.
Nadya, you can read these out yourself to indicate what people have said, if that's part of what you intend.
Yep. Okay. Some people are curious, research in autism field, new information for clients if you're a therapist, curious, also some parents of kids on the spectrum, school meetings, curiosity, personal experience. Okay. Thank you so much for sharing. So I like to start with acknowledgements because usually presenters end with acknowledgements, but I like to start and really let you know that this is not just me working. There's over 50 people who've been involved in this research since May 2019. A lot of faculty advisors, a lot of undergraduate and graduate researchers, and of course my funders. So my first funder was Montana IMBRI. which is an idea network of biomedical excellence funded by NIH, the National Institutes of Health. And this year is the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation that's making this possible, that I'm very grateful for. So why should we study language? I have a background in linguistics, and so my first passion is language, having traveled throughout my childhood and trying to compare why different languages, and how language works in the brain. So human communication system is unique in the animal kingdom. If you look across the world, a lot of species communicate. Bacteria communicate with each other, animals communicate with each other, but there's usually two kinds of parts that go into a language. There's vocabulary, or the meaning of the words. We can talk about people like Bill and Mary, and chair and desk and computer. And then we also talk about sentence structure or grammar. So if you hear a sentence like boy chases a dog, if we switch the word order around and say dog chases boy, those mean two different things. And we talk about language as a distinct part of the rest of the cognitive abilities, such as memory and attention. If you look at the animal kingdom, if you look at whales, for example, they mostly have structure in their sentences. They have songbird as well as like that. They have notes that are repeated in small sequences. They repeat, but we don't actually know what they're talking about, and there's ongoing research about that. If we look at vervet monkeys, their language is mostly vocabulary. So they produce different alarm calls. So if they have alarm call for an eagle, everybody stands up and looks up at the sky. If they have an alarm call for a snake, everybody stands up and looks down on the ground. So they're able to interpret different voice signals. But if they say snake leopard versus leopard snake, it doesn't mean anything different for them. And that is why human language is so unique, because we can have both vocabulary and structure, unlike other species. So I will introduce the biolinguistic viewpoint, which says that language is a biological phenomenon. So language is part of brain-mind, and that a lot of language development is genetically guided. Of course, there is environment, because we're all, depending on where you grow up, you may learn a different language, but the mechanism for learning language that is inside your brain, that is deemed to be genetically built. And so to give you an analogy, a lot of scientists think that language acquisition or language learning in children is like growing teeth. For example, of course, you need calcium and milk in your diet so that you can grow the teeth. But if the genetics aren't there, there's incorrect teeth numbers. For example, me, I was born without wisdom teeth. I never had wisdom teeth, and they're not there. No amount of calcium in the diet can make me grow wisdom teeth. So most people grow teeth naturally. And this compares to learning to ride a bike or learning to drive a car. For example, I just learned to drive a car earlier this year, but I was doing fine up until that point, because I was getting rides from other people or taking public transportation. So for things that are more environmental or driven by information from the environment, there's no genes for bike riding, if you will. And you do fine without that. And so for the biolinguistic viewpoint, really, language is more like growing teeth. And when we study language impairment and language development, that really helps us understand something about the brain, because we can tell what develops as it should in the majority of people, and then also how language breaks down or doesn't develop. And it can also lead to practical interventions to support communication in communities and children and families. All right, so another part of a background that is important to my talk is neurodiversity. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these words, but I'll review them anyway. So neurodiversity means that all people think differently, and that is okay. We accept all differences. Now, some people are neurodivergent, means they have brain differences that may cause extra challenges. In the typical world, this is autism, dyslexia, ADHD, mental health, acquired brain damage, and so on. And I'll give you an analogy from one of my colleagues, Dr. Jennifer Dubois from MSU Chemistry Department. So if you think about skin color and how people perceive skin color, in 1961, there was only one color in color crayon called flesh, and that was the standard that we were supposed to draw with. And already in 1962, there were up to 5 crayons for skin color. So we see improvement. And it's only later on that we see a multitude of skin colors that are described as crayons. And then in 2020, there are up to 32 colors for skin and hair. And so there's increasing awareness that people are of different types and skin colors of different types, and that is okay. Now, the challenge is, what do you do when you're so special, you're not a skin color, you're a glitter? And those of us who are neurodivergent may feel like you're so far outside the spectrum that you're a glitter, and not everybody knows what to do with glitter. I mean, glitter is amazing, but not everybody knows how to help glitter function in a society better. So in terms of neurodivergence, neurodiversity describes the idea that people interact with the world around them in different ways. There's no right way of thinking and learning and behaving. And the neurodivergent is an interrelated sensory, attentive, social, and motor differences that can present barriers to learning. For example, a lot of folks who are neurodivergent have issues with sensitivity to sensory stimuli, meaning you hear the lights, you hear the buzzing of the air conditioner, and it's really, really challenging for you to function where you hear all this buzzing around us. And there's some view that neurodivergence is considered to be genetic, but it has some evolutionary benefits, because if you go back to our caveman ancestors, it was probably good for somebody with ADHD to notice things and to find new patches of, mushrooms to collect and eat, as opposed to just sitting in a cave. It just happens to be that most neurodivergent doesn't give an advantage in the modern 9-to-5 Western society. And also for terminology, there's identity first language, autistic child, that gives more lived experience. And then there's also sometimes in clinical research, person first language, like a child with autism will be used, and I'll switch back and forth between those. All right, so today I will be talking about 3, they're officially called disorders, but challenges. So about 7% of children have developmental language disorder, also known as receptive language disorder. And those children and adults, when they grow up, they have mostly typical thinking and social skills. It's just the communication and language itself that's really hard for them. And what's notable is between 15 to 100% of youth offenders in prison have this developmental language disorder. So it really predisposes folks to challenges, because to pass a police interview, you have to have good language skills, and these folks don't. About 3% of children have autism spectrum disorders. The usual definition is challenges with repetitive behavior, sensory issues, social interaction, and communication and thinking, and challenges continue into adulthood. So these are lifelong challenges. And then between 10 and 20% of people have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, which is challenges less about deficit and more about challenge controlling attention. And these folks sometimes have language challenges as well. And what's notable is that often there's overlap between these 3 disorders within people and in families. And these challenges are often underdiagnosed, especially in minorities, females, and rural areas. And they can lead to negative outcomes, negative prospects. It can be harder to do well at school, to get a job, to have social relationships, and so on. And however, with support and therapy, these individuals can do better. And a lot of research is going on to how to support communication and other symptoms in these individuals so they can do better and survive well. All right, so now we get to gestures, the other important part of my talk. And gestures are what's known as the hand-body movements that go along with speech. Sometimes they're called co-speech gestures. And gestures can be used by babies and people who have a hard time speaking as a communication aid. And here's one of my students. So on the left here, you have a non-communicative gesture, just like when you're talking with your hands. And on the right, you have a communicative gesture, also known as iconic gesture, where you use your hands to show a shape that looks like the concept that you're, or the idea that you're talking about. So it's known, there's a lot of research that gestures can support language. So kids, babies, they learn hand signs, made up signs, or official sign language signs, and they don't have to know the grammar of a sign language. They can they can learn signs individually and can be used as gestures. And it is known back in the 80s and since then that children with language impairment and autism, they can be trained on gestures to improve comprehension of words like pronouns and prepositions. So pronoun is a word like they, preposition is a word like on. And these kids, in this study, the kids were really impaired in their communication. And for them, gestures became prosthetic devices. So just as if you injure your foot, you get some crutches, here the gestures were used to support their comprehension. Here's a few examples of gestures. So just so we're in the same page in terminology, so let me get a laser pointer. Okay, so diactic gesture is pointing. So you can point at a sofa or point at whatever it is that you want to draw people's attention to. There's also iconic gestures, and this is where a gesture looks like the object that it represents. So if you, so for example, this is from another study, not our study. If you bend your elbows and flap as a hen, then that's an iconic gesture trying to show the wings of a hen. And then there are conventional gestures, for example, an index finger placed on a mouth meaning quiet, or a thumbs up or a thumbs down. These are conventional, also known as emblem gestures. And people often use those productively. Now, there was a question prior to the talk in the audience about gestures in the living brain. So this paper by Dick et al. From 2012, they were looking at brain imaging of gestures in the top line and self-adaptive meaning grooming gestures. So when you're adjusting your shirt, for example, or scratching your cheek, as opposed to a communicative gesture. And what we see is that there's a lot of the brain lights up when you're comparing comprehension of storytelling with gestures, as opposed to just looking at a computer screen. And these in the left hemisphere, this chunk right here, that's the temporal lobe and also frontal lobe. And this is where a lot of the language sits. So the conclusion is that gestures and language overlap in the brain, although there are other studies that show that they don't. So there's disagreement in the field as usually, but it's known that at least in this paper, that gestures, communicative gestures and language, they're the same brain areas are used for both. So it's useful. So for some people, so the question is, for some people, does the gestures help when they activate more of the brain during communication? All right. At this time, I'd like to ask you to type a little bit into Q&A, any keywords that you remember about background info at this point, or any questions. And I see a question in the Q&A about, does your idea of neurodiversity include people with extensive cognitive deficits? And yes, I would say that neurodivergence can include learning disabilities and cognitive deficits as well. Okay, I see some good keywords. So gestures, neurodivergent, pointing. And then to answer a question, there's 3 types of gestures, but we're mostly considering iconic gestures, the ones that help with communication. And there's ongoing research what kind of gesture helps mostly with neurodivergent. It's sometimes iconic, sometimes pointing. All right. Thank you all so much. All right, so now to present some recent results from my team. A key research question is how to support development of language with gestures in neurodiverse children and adults. So we're looking at not only neurodivergent, but also typically developing kids. And then can gestures made by speakers help listeners? So sometimes it's hard for neurodivergent and neurotypical people to make hand gestures. That's why if the speakers make hand gestures and then children and adults try to understand those, that where the research question is whether they can support communication. And our long-term objectives, how to effectively help families with children with ASD, autism, language impairment, and ADHD understand how to communicate with their children based on scientific evidence, and also how to contribute to mitigation of communication challenges, especially in remote areas via telehealth information. We're not there yet, but we're working towards those goals. And the key method for us is testing comprehension of language with and without link gestures. And the participants, like I said, did not have to make gestures because that can be hard due to challenges with moving their fingers and so on. So we used eye tracking method, and some of you may be familiar with that. And what that means is it's a leap of faith, essentially, as a method. And most people, when they think about something in the world that they see around them, they look at it. So if you're thinking about a computer, you're probably looking at that particular computer, and there's a way to measure that attention and infer what you're thinking about based on where you're looking. So at the bottom here, I show a bar that's called Gaze Point. It's a company that makes a very cost-effective eye tracking, and these dots here are infrared lines that can show where the participant is looking. And on the right-hand side, I have a picture from another study of how this particular program tracks people's eyes and tracks the pupils. Um, so the participant is looking at a computer screen. This eye tracking bar sits underneath the computer screen, and we can see where the participants are looking at a computer screen. It's pretty neat technology. All right, now one more thing I should tell you about, and this is determiners. You may be wondering, well, what is a determiner? And determiner is words like the and another and same and that, and another word for them is articles. Now, the is the most common word in the English language that we find many studies that children, both typical and neurodivergent, struggle with understanding of this word. And so there are two linguistic terms that you should be aware of. One is co-reference, and this means that if you mention something in one sentence and then mention it again in sentence two, you're talking about the same object as before. So to show you a sentence that we use in our study, fishy and turtle are two characters, and they have a world where they can go different places. So if we say fishy touches an apple and then turtle touches the same apple, that means they're touching the same apple, one apple that they're affecting, both of them. And that's co-reference. Another term to remember is just joint reference, which is mentioning different objects in the second sentence. So if we have two characters, turtle and fishy, and we say turtle touches an egg and then fishy touches another egg, that means that there are two different eggs that are touched by one by turtle and another one by fishy. So a lot of language is, it's about, are you affecting the same object across two different sentences, or you're affecting two different objects across two sentences? So that's something to remember. And these are the gestures that we used, and we're thinking, how can we help kids understand these determiners better. And so American Sign Language has 3 signs that can be adapted to this meaning. So there's a sign for different, where you start with a cross in your fingers and split them apart. You push them apart, and that's a sign for different. And then there's a sign for same, where it's in here, where you move a hand shape like this side to side. That means same. And then we also had a hand shape for any, because sometimes the determiners can mean any, and that's like a sideways thumbs up. So these gestures were adapted from American Sign Language for consistency, and we were wondering if they can support interpretation of these determiners or articles. And I worked with a couple of brilliant computer science students to come up with this interactive game. So this was presented on a computer screen, and the lady in the video in the middle, the participants could click the video to hear and see the prompt. And then we had the 2 characters on upper right, fishy and turtle, and they could click the characters, and they didn't have to click and drag. They could click a character, and then the cursor would become the character, so it was very clear what was going on. And sometimes there were a few eggs to click on, and apples were what's known as distractor. So, in case you don't know what egg is, you may click on an apple and would know that you're making a mistake. And so then the question was, if the lady in the video said turtle clicks an egg, and here we have turtle on one of the eggs. And then if the lady in the video says, and fishy clicks, and she makes the same gesture, where would fishy go? Would fishy go to one of the other eggs, which would be a different response, or would fishy go to the same egg as the turtle? So those were our main responses. Would fishy go to one of the other eggs, or would fishy go to the same egg as turtle? So we're trying to make this child-friendly. And then for a method, we had 3 times that we asked kids about determiners. So it was a pre-test, so time 0, where we only had speech. So the lady in the video, she didn't make any gestures, she would just speak the determiners. So we were testing how kids understand those with just speech. And then at time 1, this was a mini intervention. So we had both language and gestures, so determiners and gestures, and also gestures by themselves. And prior to that, we taught our participants that, for example, this gesture means different, this gesture means same, so we gave them some instruction about what these gestures mean. They didn't have to guess. And then in time 2, in the post-test, we again tested these determiners by speech only to see if there was any improvement. And these were our participants. So we had 48 participants from 28 families, and we had a transdiagnostic approach. And what this means is we're not focusing specifically on a label. We're seeing what are the participants' abilities and disabilities. So we had autism language impaired, which included 2 folks with both autism and ADHD. They were on average 7.5 years old, but if you look at their mental age, they were around 4 to 3 years old. So their cognitive abilities as measured by standardized tests were lower than their chronological age. And I acknowledge that standardized tests are not great tools for kids who are impaired, who have different abilities. And so these may be too low because sometimes these participants cannot show us that they're able to pass these tasks. Then we had a group of autism language normal, which included 4 participants with ADHD. They were on average 15 years old, and their mental abilities were around the same numbers as well. So they were pretty strong group. Then we had kids with developmental language disorder, which included 1 kid with ADHD, on average 7 years old, and notice their mental age. So they're like on an IQ test, they were pretty smart, but their language was lagging behind, and that's the definition of developmental language disorder. Then we had some typical kids who are very smart, and then we had some typical siblings, so siblings of kids on the spectrum, but they're they don't have a diagnosis, and they were pretty smart as well. Now, in terms of how they understood these gestures and determiners, if we look at typical kids, they were adult-like, meaning they gave us different responses when they heard another, and they gave us same responses when they heard words like the, and the same that was expected. The siblings did well, although they had some initial challenges with the definite article, the. And then the autism language normal was doing pretty well as well. If you look at autism language impaired, they have poor knowledge, and they were picking a lot of different answers as opposed to same answers, and they weren't varying their answers as much, meaning they had a poor understanding. And language impaired kids had poor understanding too. So what about their eye tracking? So for eye tracking, I looked at the patterns that the kids were showing, and I realized, well, it's not that all kids with autism show one kind of eye tracking pattern and all the typical kids show another eye tracking pattern. That was not the case. So there was variation within each diagnosis group. So I decided, okay, we're going to divide the groups by how they understand these determiners or articles at the beginning and see how their eye tracking varies. So we had 3 groups. Group 1 was adult-like, and they had mostly correct behavioral answers. And this group had some siblings, some typical kids, some kids with autism language normal, and some ADHD. And then we had group 0-1. They had some deficits, and they had mistakes in behavioral answers, and they also had a mixed group across diagnosis. And then group 0 had strong deficits, and again, a mixed group across diagnosis. I should say that 9 participants of the sample, mostly younger, could not engage with eye tracking in the computer task, and they need another method so they can show what they know. All right, let's look at some eye tracking. So to read these graphs, we're looking at, on the y-axis, on the vertical, this is proportion of looks. This is how often they look at a particular location. And on the x-axis is time. So this is between 0 and 12 seconds. And I should also go back a slide and show you what these AOIs, or areas of interest, mean. So this is a representation of the computer game and a screenshot from the analysis that we did. So we have the face, a box for the face of the speaker, a box for the body of the gesture space. And what the program does is that it can, if we draw this box and label a gesture, the program will tell us, aha, the people were looking here at this particular time, and we know that they were looking at the gesture. Then they were also here, distractor area of interest. So the participants weren't looking usually at the distractor because we didn't mention the distractor. And then here we have different ice creams. And then this is the same area of interest. So we're going back to the fishy and turtle ending up on the same ice cream, or are they ending up on a different ice cream? So here, the same location is in blue, and the different location where they look at different location is in red. So let's take this step by step. So on the left-hand side, here the kids heard another. So fishy clicks an apple, and turtle clicks another apple. And we see a very strong look to a different location, meaning that they understand that another means you're talking about 2 different things. And this is for, I should say, this is for group 1, and these were showing adult-like comprehension. In the middle, we have the same, meaning we said fishy clicks an ice cream, and turtle clicks the same ice cream. So they should go into one location. And here we have this blue peak. So they're looking at the same location in blue, and that's the right answer as well. And then for D is the one that's usually harder. So we say fishy clicks an apple and turtle touches the apple. This group, the group that does well, we should see a blue peak as well, meaning that they understand that you have to go to the same location for the, and this is eye tracking. So this is where we are looking at how their eye looks change. So this is good. This is the pattern that we like to see. So we have red peak, blue peak, and the blue peak, 2 blue peaks. All right, so let's look at what the group that has some impairment. So they do well on the most articles, but they have some impairment with this. So see with another, they have a red peak. This is what we expect. This is good. For the same, they have a blue peak. This is what we expect. This is good. But look, for they don't have a blue peak. They have a red peak. So it means that they think that if you're talking about the apple, it means a different apple, which is the opposite of what it means for adults and for group 1 who was a Dudley. And when I saw these data and they were so clear, I was amazed because, maybe kids know the answer, but they don't click the right button. Maybe we can say maybe it's just a behavioral mistake. But here we're actually looking at where they're looking on the computer screen, and we see that they really know the answer, and their answer that they know is incorrect. So this is the group where we thought, well, maybe would gestures help this particular group adjust this comprehension from so that it becomes more blue, like the same, and less red. So, and this is what we did, and this is the test. So where we paired language with gestures, and we see that if you look at another, there's still a red peak, and notice there's a turquoise line here as well. This is where they're looking at the body space and they're looking at the gestures. So we see a red peak with another. That's what we expect. We see a blue peak with the same. We expect that. And now look, we're beginning to see blue peaks with the. So these children are beginning to understand, this gesture, the same gesture goes with the, maybe the answer should be the same as opposed to different. And on the right-hand side, we see that they were actually looking to a different location with a different gesture, and the same location here in blue with a same gesture. So we see improvement here with gestures. And if we compare the pre-test with post-test, we see that in the pre-test, when this group with mild impairments, they understood the to be to indicate a different location, which is incorrect for most adults. And then in the post-test, after exposure to gestures, they now have a strong blue peak showing that they understand, I now understand that the means that it's the same location. So in the grand scheme of things, when you're talking about little words like determiners, maybe they're not, you may think they're not as important, but in this particular case, we're really able to show that we can make a difference in this group of kids with gestures for this part of language. A caveat, of course, is that we don't have long-term evidence whether this improvement stays with them, and we really can't tell whether there's a diagnosis or age-specific for those. Okay, now one more group I have to show you, and this is the group 0, where they had problems with articles across the board. And we see that they're able to complete the task, the language game, but they're not looking at the face. They're looking at the body space, even though there's no gestures. And they're also looking this kind of brownish line here. They're looking at the distractors. So they're looking at where we haven't mentioned. So if we are talking about ice creams, and they look at oranges, so that shows some understanding of basic words. And they end up looking more at the red line. That means they're looking more at the different response and not in the same one, and they don't differ between different words. So this particular group, it seems that there's impairment in how they understand language. And also these groups did not benefit from gestures. So sometimes gestures help, but for some kids who are a bit more impaired, at least in our task, the gestures did not help. Okay. So to summarize, eye tracking shows when participants do not understand the apple, and they really do not think that it can mean the same. And a specific deficit with Z versus other determiners, which require similar thinking efforts, because if you think, well, I understand the same apple versus the apple, it's the same, very similar words, but we see different patterns, and that's how language acquisition and language development sometimes work, is that we change one word, and sometimes kids go from understanding to not understanding. And another thing that we learned is that eye tracking really does not work for all participants and not an interactive task. And we really need neuroimaging, so brain imaging, and a passive viewing task, meaning when the participants just look at a computer screen and we measure their brain and see how they do. So I'm going to take a few more minutes to show you what we're working on currently. And this is brain imaging. So this is EEG, also known as electroencephalography. And what you do is you wear this cap, a foam cap, and it has these white knobs, and we record electrical activity in the brain. And this in the middle is a picture of a neuron that your brain is made up of. And sometimes you have positive voltage on the cell body and negative voltage on the dendrites, or the appendages of the neuron in your brain, and we can tell this difference in electrical activity. And here, N400 means that there is a 400 milliseconds after you see something, your brain understands what it is that you see. 100 milliseconds after you see something or hear something, your brain says, aha, I see it. And then 400 milliseconds afterwards, you say, I know what it is. And especially when there's a mismatch. So let's hear this following sentence. If you say, I'm putting on butter on a bread, that's a usual situation. Okay. If you say, I'm putting on butter on a sock, so all your brains just did this M400 signal, meaning there's something weird in what you hear and see. So we can leverage this task. So I'm going to show you a few gestures that we used in this task. So we had a non-communicative gesture, like adjusting hair. And then we had an animation, a bouquet of flowers. Then we had a communicative gesture. And that's a gesture adapted from American Sign Language for bouquet. And then we had a mismatching spoken word.
Cat.
Cat. So we had this task where the participants are looking at this. They don't have to reply. So they're able to, even kids who are not able to respond as well are able to participate in this. And we're comparing how participants understand communicative gesture versus spoken word. So this is a very busy graph. And this is very few participants. We only had a couple of participants in each group, but we investigated typical 4-year-olds, neurodivergent tweens, and typical tweens, so between 8 and 12 years old. And the top graph shows speech versus animation, and the bottom line of graphs versus speech versus gesture. And what you should note is that after this dotted line at 0, if you have the red line above the blue line, that means they're understanding the speech. So for gesture speech, we have for neurodivergent tweens and typical 4-year-olds and typical tweens, the red line is above the blue line. And the red line means how they understand the mismatch. So when you have a bouquet versus a cat, and a blue line is a match. So like cat, picture of a cat and a word of a cat, or gesture of a cat and a word of a cat. And then this means that the brain is understanding this. So if we see this difference between sentences that match and sentences that don't match in the brain with brain activity, and I should say that on the y-axis, on the vertical line here, is these microvolts that we measure electrical activity with, and on the horizontal, that's the time. I haven't said that. So we see that there's evidence that we see that these particular participants who are fairly smart, that they're able to understand gestures with speech, and we're able to measure that with brain activity. They don't actually have to point. So that was a really strong breakthrough for us. And our next study that we're doing right now is with the support of Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, is we're looking into FNIRS. And FNIRS are, you can see on the right, these hats with black knobs. And this is called functional near-infrared spectroscopy. So whereas EEG was looking at electrical brain activity, FNIR is looking at hemoglobin, which is a cell that carries oxygen in your body, in the blood, and that changes with brain activity, and that gives the location of the brain. So here on the right hand side, this is a representation of the brain. And on the outside of the brain, we have a light source, which shines red light into the scalp. And then we have a light detector. And then when the red light, infrared light, hits your brain, it diffuses. And then we can measure how that bounces off your blood cells and figure out what parts of your brain are active. And what we're doing for this task is we're asking caregivers to tell a story, and they would be wearing these motion capture gloves that a group that I was working with developed. And the idea is to correlate how they gesture with to think about, if you gesture like a lot, does that mean more brain activity in the kid that is listening? So that is a fairly exciting study for us. And this is our HAD, and this is really impressive for me because we're combining both EEG, which is the white knobs, the electrical activity, and the black knobs, which is the functional near-infrared spectroscopy. And we can have both electrical activity that gives us time and spatial location, which gives us location of the signal, and we can get more information from the same recording. So for me, this is really exciting things. And I'd like to end with a couple of points. One is that there's many groups, this is not us, this is another group in Greece, that is looking at translation of sign language and gestures using machine learning. So using advanced AI, artificial intelligence tools, they're able to recognize in live time what particular gesture means. So that is the next step in the development of this. So there can be automatic translation between kid gesture, adult gesture, and so on. So to conclude, gestures do help. Some kids, as we show in group 01, they do better with gestures, and they include kids and teenagers and adults with autism, ADHD, and language impairments. And multimodal communication, meaning when you have auditory or verbal words with hand gestures made by speakers, that can lead to more clear communication and better communication. And this can be for caregivers and teachers and providers and children. And we're hoping to translate or apply our findings so that we can support all individuals. As for future research, there's inconclusive research as to whether gestures can help or hurt communication. There's some evidence that in Alzheimer's, for example, gestures just make them more confused, but we don't know about Parkinson's and Down syndrome and other parts. These are references. Of note, I would like to draw your attention to Valaton, Signing with Babies and Children. It's about 20-page document, very accessible, available online. And Valaton talks about a lot of ways to apply hand gestures to language development, and it's a very good reading. And this is my contact information. And finally, I'd like to give a shout out to signingtime.com. I'm not affiliated with them, but they do provide a lot of videos that can help support communication with gestures. Thank you so much. I welcome questions.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Modyanova. That was really interesting. There were many responses by the audience of varying types, as usual. But I must say there were a very robust response. So, I mean, that means you really provoked some questions and touched a lot of people. So we thank you for that. I'm going to try to capture a couple of the questions and also just ask you one off the top of my head, just before I go into the questions from the audience. I just want to clarify something. When you say that gestures help, my initial question was, do you know why they help? And I mean that in the neurobiological sense. Can you predict who will benefit in advance? And then as you continued along, I figured, well, maybe that's what the EEG plus NFIRS studies are all about. Am I right about that? Or, what's your answer to my question, if it makes any sense to you?
It makes absolute sense. I would say that communication, our brain is very flexible. And there's a lot of ways that you can break, but there's a lot of ways that our brain is very powerful and it can adapt very well. Especially with communication, it's known that kids with growing up without a language, they use whatever they see in their environment to adapt that as a language. One case in point is Nicaraguan sign language, where deaf kids were exposed to basic signs, and they created a fully fledged sign language based on basic signs that they were gaining for caregivers. So our brain is very robust at adapting signals and trying to put them together. Not everybody's brains, but a lot of people's brains. And so, um, um, to answer your question, if people interpret gestures as communicative material, they're able to recruit some of the language areas in their brain to use that to help them with understanding speech. That's what's known as the multimodal communication, where you take physical gesture and speech that you hear and your brain puts them together. And there's a lot of research about how the brain does that, and this is where the brain imaging study comes in, and it's all ongoing work.
I don't mean to be hyper reductive here, but I mean, when a person with language difficulties understands a hand gesture, learns, well, I'm giving away
Learns and understand it, yeah.
It's a function of learning. It is
Yes.
a type of learning, yes?
Yes, it's absolutely learning. Yeah. And the question is who will benefit from this kind of learning, because we saw some kids do not benefit and maybe they just need a longer lesson. Maybe they're not the way their brain works or doesn't allow them to put these gestures and words together. And this is a topic for future research.
I read one of your papers, or at least part of it, and I think it did have to do with your study on determiners.
Yes.
And you said that even in the pretest condition, before you gave them these tests, it turns out that the people divided into three groups. There were approximately 50% who were already able to understand determiners,
Yes.
just without even any instruction.
Yes.
Then you said there were 26% who couldn't engage
Yes.
with the game or the exercise.
Yes.
I'm not exactly sure why, but maybe nobody knows why. But there were, in other words, half understood determiners even before you gave this test.
Yes.
A quarter approximately could not even engage with the test that you gave them on the screen. And then there were approximately a quarter, to be precise, 23%, who had poor initial knowledge of determiners, you said,
Mm-hmm.
but they could learn how to use
Yes.
them. So I suppose that's your target group, yes?
Yes, and the question is, how do we know ahead of time who these target kids are, and kids and adults that we tested that would benefit from the gestures, and sometimes we don't know ahead of time.
And then, not to belabor the point, but I mean, I suppose it would be an objective, of course, to expand that one quarter of the total population to a much larger number so that you could reach more people, yes?
Yes, absolutely. And of course, one of my personal goals is to reach the quarter who are not able to engage and participate in the task. And those are usually level 3 autism, who are minimally speaking or non-speaking. And there's research out there, we haven't yet done that, but there's research out there that they are responding to EEG, that we're able to record their brain activity. Even if they're not able to answer a question with their behavior, their brain still responds to the pictures that they see and hear. So those are the people we'd like to help as well. And maybe we just acknowledge that some people just need pictures and words, like the augmented communication with just pictures and words. And maybe that is enough. Maybe gestures is too much for them. And we don't yet know the answer to that question.
Very interesting. So I heard you say earlier in the talk that spoken language and gestures activate similar or the same areas of the brain.
Yes.
or more or less. So
Yes.
one of our audience members asked the question, are you, she says, or he or she says, are you saying that hand movement enhances the speech part of the brain? So how do you answer that one?
Again, it depends on who you're talking to. In a sizable group in the study that we did with eye tracking, it seems that the iconic gestures, when they communicate, when they're used, they enhance language comprehension. So they're able to be used by the same brain areas. And but not everybody. It doesn't work for everybody. At least
Here's
how
another
we were able
question.
to measure. Yeah.
Here's another question. Would it be possible that a gesture or gestures could support attention as well as understanding of meaning? For example, the questioner says, switching attention between tasks or increasing attention span or focus to a particular task.
Yes, absolutely. There's a lot of research by Susan Golden Meadow and her colleagues about math, using gestures in math. So if you're using, for example, your fingers to do arithmetic, that helps kids in math classes, or manipulating shapes as you're doing math. And that can be director of attention as well, and helping with switching tasks as well. Absolutely. So yes, it's not only language that gestures can help, but also math and other areas.
Interesting. And here's another question. I'm going to quote here. Says the questioner, I was wondering if it would be possible to support language with gesture for kids within the ADHD spectrum that have high IQ, so their language is good, but they have difficulties with second meaning or intention as they are too literal. Uh, for example, this person says, I told my child that we need to wait for the green light for us to cross the road, and he said the green light is not for us, it's for everyone. Would
Uh-huh.
gesture be of help to support their literal understanding?
It's certainly possible. You can use pointing in this case. You can say the green light can be just for us. You point to yourself, or for everybody. You point to everybody. And this kind of communication we can emphasize with gestures and clarify with gestures to follow up. Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
I just want to acknowledge all the people in the audience who at some point raised the question that always comes up when we talk about this subject of ASD and other illnesses of neurodevelopmental character. What constitutes neurodivergent? What constitutes disorder? There's a huge amount of controversy about this, and we're not going to go into it here or now. But I just want to acknowledge the people in the audience who ask questions like that, and we just, that each one of those questions.
If I can say a few words, I mean, I've worked with hundreds
Quickly,
of
because we have to leave
yeah,
quickly.
hundreds of kids with autism that I worked with. Sometimes it's about how much it bothers the people around you. If people around you are bothered by your behavior, that's sometimes labeled a disorder, or sometimes it affects the people themselves, where they're level 2 or level 3 autism and they're impaired and are not able to take care of themselves. That is a much more challenging area, and that they need a lot of help. So it's all about supporting people and providing tailored support for what they need so they can do better in the society.
Thanks for that answer. I appreciate that. Thank you very much for providing us with this incredibly enlightening talk. And I'd like to thank everyone else for joining us and ask you to please consider making a donation to BBRF today. 100% of every dollar donated for research is invested in our research grants, and we can do this because our operating expenses are covered by separate foundation grants. This means that when you donate a dollar for research, that dollar goes directly to scientists. So to make a gift, please visit bbrfoundation.org or call 800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded, and if you missed any portion of this presentation or would like to share it, please visit the events and webinars page on our website. And please join us again next month when we present another mental health research webinar on September 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We look forward to seeing you then. In closing, I'm hoping that you will keep in mind Dr. Jeffrey Borenstein's regular closing admonition, which is together we can dramatically improve the lives of those living with mental illness and enable more people to live full, happy, and productive lives. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, BBRF.